call is Decatur, Illinois. Joan on a Republican line.
Oh, yes. I would like to ask Michelle where she was raised.
Well, I was raised all over. My family moved around a lot as I was growing up, but I was born in Chicago, and I have since lived in many places. In California, I lived for a while in Washington, D.C., I lived in Nashville, Tennessee. I've lived in a number of different places in the country.
Belchertown, Massachusetts. Good morning. Eugene on our independent line.
Good morning. First of all, I think Michelle is conveniently leaving out a key component to the drug war. I grew up outside of L.A. Now I live outside of Springfield. The violence associated with inner-city drug use is a lot different from the guy down the street who's maybe selling marijuana in white suburbia. Now, where I grew up in L.A., there was another gang called the Hells Angels that was cracked down on just as much as any other African or Hispanic gangs. So there, I think, is why you see a focus on, I mean, you don't see people driving down my street doing drive-by shootings. I would like to hear your opinion on that.
Well, I'm glad you raised that, because I think most people assume that the drug war really is aimed at rooting out violent drug offenders. But as I indicated, the data suggests that the principal targets of the drug war have not been violent offenders at all, but kind of rounding up in mass very low-level, non-violent drug offenders in poor communities of color. And when you brand them felons, then you kind of virtually guarantee that they will have a very difficult time ever getting work in the legal economy. And, as we know, as the data shows, about 70% of people who are released from prison return within 3 years. And so if you're concerned about violent crime in poor inner-city communities, as I am, then you should absolutely oppose the drug war. Because the drug war isn't concerned primarily with rooting out violent offenders or dealing with the serious problem of violent crime in these communities. In fact, initially when the drug war was announced by Reagan, there was considerable resistance within some law enforcement agencies that were concerned about diverting their resources away from serious crimes like murder, rape, robbery, burglary. They were concerned about diverting those resources towards drug law enforcement. Well, how did the Reagan administration overcome those objections? It offered cash, these huge cash grants to law enforcement agencies that were willing to boost up dramatically the volume of their drug arrests. So the drug war has been motivated by kind of generating high volumes of drug arrests. Kind of that's been the engine, rather than, devoting limited law enforcement resources to focusing on how do we address violent offenders in the system and ensure that kind of these communities aren't plagued with high levels of violence. So if you're concerned about violent crime, you should absolutely oppose the drug war and ask of your local law enforcement agencies to use their resources more intelligently and in a more disciplined fashion.
Washington, D.C. is next for our guest, Anthony, on our Democrats line. Good morning.
Good morning. How you doing, sir?
Fine, thank you. Go ahead.
Yes, I like to say, as a ex-felon, that you can get your record expunged, I believe, in different states. So maybe we need to start looking another way to for a lot of felons to get their record expunged once they serve their time. But I also like to say that as when I came out, I had a lot of white folks to really help me out. So I don't want this to turn like a black and white issue for a lot of people. But also I had this issue like if you're a felon and the government taking taxes from you, so you should be able to vote. So you can't, as long as the government keep taking federal taxes from you, I always thought that you should be able to vote and do everything else. So maybe ex-felons should stop paying taxes through the government if they consider them as a felon. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you're right that some people have been successful in getting their records expunged, but the data indicates that only a tiny fraction of people who are labeled felons are able to get their records expunged. And I am very supportive of legislation that is pending in some areas around the country that would expunge records kind of immediately upon release for particularly low-level drug offenses. So I think that we should look into the possibility of making expungement more widely available to people who have done time, particularly for drug crime. And you're absolutely right. People who are convicted of crimes and then released, they're expected to pay taxes. In fact, what most people don't know is that many people who are released from prison are also expected to pay back the costs of their imprisonment, court costs, fees and fines. Sometimes they're expected to pay back all these fees and fines before they're able to regain their right to vote. They're also expected to pay back accumulated child support payments that have accumulated while they're in prison. In fact, if you're kind of, someone who's been released from prison and lucky enough to get a job, up to 100% of your wages can be garnished to pay back court costs, child support payments, and fees. 100% of your wages can be garnished. Now, what realistically do we expect people to do? They can be legally discriminated against employment. They're barred from public housing for a minimum of 5 years and can be legally discriminated against in access to housing for the rest of their lives. And, then they're expected to pay back thousands of dollars in debt as a result. Well, not surprisingly, this system creates a closed circuit of perpetual marginality of people cycling in and out of prison, often for the rest of their lives.
Is there any federal effort to change the way to allow felons to get their voting rights back and things along that nature?
Yes, well, there's efforts in multiple states around the country to overturn felon disenfranchisement laws, and yes, I believe in Congress as well. There has been some movement, in looking at granting felons their voting rights, and the Second Chance Act was recently passed that provides some funding for training and assistance with reentry to try to ease the transition for prisoners from prison life and help them to find jobs. But the problem here is that kind of no matter how much money we devote to job training and assistance for those who have been released from prison, and about 600,000 people are released from prison every year. 600,000. No matter how much money and resources we devote to that, as long as it remains legal to discriminate against these folks in virtually every aspect of their economic, political, and social life, they will remain trapped in a second-class status. During the Jim Crow era, the problem wasn't that, black folks couldn't get a job. People had jobs, but they were relegated permanently to a lower tier of jobs. And that's the kind of system, in many respects, that we have today. Even those who are lucky enough to get a job on release from prison find that they're forever trapped in a lower category of jobs by virtue of their prison record.
Washington, D.C., next for our guest, Anthony, is next. You're on with Michelle Alexander. She's the author of The New Jim Crow.
Good morning.
Go ahead, sir.
How you doing, Ms. Alexander?
Good, thank you.
I just want to know, in your book, is there any chapter in there which referring to what's that guy named Herbert Hoover and how he had targeted black folks, especially like the Panther Party, and how that equates to today?
Yeah, you're absolutely right that there is a very interesting history of the FBI under Herbert Hoover's leadership targeting African American groups, particularly those that were politically active. But no, I don't spend much time discussing that particular chapter in our racial history.